April 12, 1961, the Vostok 1, a ship launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, carried Soviet Air Force pilot Yuri Gagarin up out of the atmosphere through a complete orbit around the Earth to a greatest distance of 327 kilometers from the Earth's surface. Gagarin, who had just turned 27 a month before, had just become the first human being to go to outer space, over 100 kilometers altitude. On the morning of the flight, according to some people's stories, Sergei Korolyov, the Soviet engineer responsible for Sputnik 1, the first man-made Earth satellite, Sputnik 2, which took the dog Laika to space, Luna 2, the first man-made object to touch the moon's surface, and now Vostok 1, had to personally reseal the hatch onto the spacecraft. Korolyov was suffering intense anxiety in the build-up to the launch, as 12 of the previous 24 Soviet launches had failed. But Gagarin, apparently cool as a cucumber, asked for music to be played. And at 6:07 as he took off, declared, which means, here we go, adding, see you soon, friends. Poyekale became a Soviet cultural catchphrase representing the spirit of the space race. Orbiting the Earth once before landing again, Gagarin reached top speed of just over 28,000 kilometers per hour. Once home, he became an international celebrity and left an indelible mark on human history. Gagarin would continue to enjoy celebrity status and an array of military promotions until 1968, when he died inside a... This one's going to be difficult for YouTube terms of service. In a speech on the morning of the launch, Gagarin said,
"Can you think of a task more difficult than the one assigned to me? It is not responsibility to a single person, or dozens of people, or even a collective. It is responsibility to all Soviet people, to all mankind, to its present and its future. And if I am nevertheless venturing on this flight, it is because I am a communist, because I draw strength from unexampled exploits performed by my compatriots, Soviet men and women. I know that I shall muster all my willpower, the better to do the job."
Even from this first step outside of our own atmosphere, the people's history of space has been a persistent presence, a spectre haunting the history of space travel, we could say. Naturally, the shape of world power still warped the degree to which it was a representative people's history. While Into Cosmos took astronauts of Asian, African, and Arabic origin into space, it was still ultimately a mostly white space program. Also, the first woman in space was like the 12th person in space, which doesn't make total sense. I'm checking. It seems, I just made sure. Women are like half of people. Incidentally, the Americans put a man on the moon before letting a woman go to space, which I think is honestly pretty emblematic of something. Like, yes, Valentina Tereshkova was the 12th person in space, but Sally Ride was the 120th. Is that a mathematical proof that while the Soviet Union was still misogynistic, it was literally 10 times more feminist than America? I'm not a scientist. I couldn't possibly say. Britain, if anyone was wondering, didn't put a man into space first, but we didn't put a woman into space first either. The first British astronaut, Helen Sharman, won a radio call-in competition for a free seat on a Soviet spaceship launch. I'm not sure what that says about us as a country, but I am going to start listening to the radio more. A lot of the time when people think about the space race, they just think about the moon landing. And that feels really like an example of history is written by the victors, because while landing a man on the moon is a big deal, another human being on a different celestial body for the first time in history, a giant leap for mankind, if you like, so is putting the first animal in space, the first person in space, the first man-made object on the moon, conducting the first spacewalk, the first interplanetary flight, the first hard and soft landings on Mars and Venus, and all of those were done by the Soviet Union, while the United States of America was still figuring out that women are just as capable of sitting still in a metal tube while a bunch of people fire them into space as men are. I want to talk a bit about why we, as leftists, should care about space. Space exploration has led to developments in science, which is obviously not an uncomplicated and unpolluted virtue. Like, a lot of the history itself comes from World War II and the developments of rockets for intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons and so on. But not all these developments have been either negative or beneficial only toward the end of exploring space more. For one, lots of medical research and development has been done on the ISS. For a handful of consumer product examples, wireless headphones, freeze-dried food, long-life tires, and memory foam were all developed because of space exploration. Personally, I feel like in the scientific arena, though, the strongest argument against space exploration is that all the funding should be going to combating climate change instead. But even there, it should be said that the views of Earth that the space exploration has given us have been massively helpful in developing weather prediction systems that can help reduce the effects of climate disasters. One thing you could say about why we should care about space is, well, we live there. We have looked up and told stories about the patterns and shapes that we see in the stars for as long as we've been human beings, and that's something that connects all of us. Even from a place as brightly lit as the middle of London, on a clear night you can look up and see light shining down from other planets in our solar system onto us. Earlier this year, my girlfriend and I got our own telescope, and it was really good timing because the planets were all visible in the sky for a short time, something that science journalists dubbed a planetary parade. Going out with the telescope one evening, we got our first pictures of Mars, Jupiter, Venus, and a completely dog-ass picture of Mercury, which is too small for us to see properly with our size of scope, and the telescope needed collimating anyway. Saturn, however, eluded us. We'd been out the week before getting the telescope, watching as the sunset let the lights of the planets drip sleepily into view. Venus, the third brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, was clear and bright, and we waited with bated breath as Saturn blinked glacially into existence just below her. It was absolutely breathtaking in the way only the universe can be. But, sadly, by the time we were back with our telescope, Saturn had moved below the horizon and out of sight. Teasing details out of the pictures has been a learning experience. In 7 years being a YouTuber, I think this is the first time I've bothered to learn what ISO and shutter speed really mean, and the first time I've really considered getting a better camera. Jupiter's famous weather bands were the first detail we could make out properly, though they weren't nearly as easy to see on camera as through the eyepiece. They're so very faint, but it was unbelievably exciting. Generally in astrophotography, the way we get around not seeing very much of something is to take lots and lots of photos of it at different exposures and then stack them together to pull out the details. If you do this with a video, you can separate out the frames and put them through software to do it en masse automatically, though the downside here is how it tends to sort of beautify the outcome. She's giving orb, she's giving smooth, she's giving AI filter on your phone that you didn't ask for and can't switch off. I prefer getting my shots into Photoshop and messing around with my individual pictures, trying to get out the details I could see through the eyepiece that the camera couldn't capture. A lot of imaging of space requires this kind of imaginative seeing. For example, the Akatsuki probe from JAXA has given us the highest resolution photos of Venus ever produced, but it's using infrared and ultraviolet imaging. In true colour, Venus is as blank and white as a pearl. My own best picture of Venus, and also only so far, is this crescent. Because Venus is closer to the sun than we are, it appears in phases like the moon. Incidentally, when you can see things moving in real time in the videos I'm showing, what you're actually seeing is the turning of the Earth. Looking through a telescope has a way of putting you in touch with time and space's paradoxical vastness and minutiae. Mars, being so much smaller, doesn't give us nearly as much interesting detail as Jupiter, but you can, very faintly, see the white of one of its polar ice caps. Mars, a place we have often, as a culture, looked at and imagined that it's a place we may one day live. I think this is probably the strongest argument you can really make for why leftists should care about space. If humanity survives this current polycrisis, and I believe it will, then going to space is a part of our future. The largest personality in space travel in the richest country in the world right now is Elon fucking Musk, an actual sea-hiling fascist. If the future of space travel is up to the big boa birthday boy, the only people in the future who will be allowed past the atmosphere of humanity's cradle planet will be straight and white. They'll only let Katy Perry back up there in a few years if she proclaims her love for the fatherland and publicly renounces the idea that she ever kissed a girl. Besides Musk himself, capitalists only see space as a market, an expanse of resources to be mined. Their devotion to capital makes them completely blind to all beauty in the universe. Solar radiation management, the introduction of reflective particles into the atmosphere to reduce the greenhouse effect, is the favourite capitalist climate technology solution after carbon capture and storage. Studies into the viability of SRM have shown that its use may cause devastating droughts in the South American rainforests. You know, the rainforests that are also called the lungs of the planet. Also, this is really cool. Countries like the UK have no regulations whatsoever on geoengineering, so companies that are working with this kind of thing can do whatever they want as long as no one sets fire to all their equipment. Drew Pendergrass in Half-Earth Socialism describes the constant overcast weather that SRM would cause as the permanent grey skies of neoliberalism. So picture it. The world is clouded over, the air quality painfully polluted, the ultra-rich get to see clear skies from their private jets, mountaintop resorts, and private clear sky zones they've created with geoengineering firms. The only people who will venture beyond our atmosphere are all part of a eugenics program to breed the most historically illiterate human who has ever lived. You see on the weather forecast there's going to be an incredibly rare clear night, so you head down to what you think is a public park to look at the stars and the shapes in the sky and think of the stories that your ancestors have told for thousands of years. And then a private security guard with all the legal powers of a police officer pops up and says,
Excuse me, Mum, this is a private park, and appreciating the majesty of the cosmos is a customer-only feature. You have to be a Barclays Reward Points member to understand your place in a vast universe of intricate beauty and wonder.
Quite the bad ending. But if I was going to tell you about the good ending, I might just tell you about the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. The Mars Trilogy is about an awful lot of things, but in the most literal sense, it's about human population on Mars and a series of subsequent revolutions. It's a science fiction epic that spans 200 years, from the first human landing on Mars through intense political struggle to a vision of a future society where nobody is homeless or starving, where capitalism is a distant memory. The human lifespan is massively extended, and human beings have begun to inhabit every part of the solar system, as well as travel far beyond in search of new discovery. It is a beautiful and impressive work, both in literary and imaginative terms, telling a story both with compelling characters moving through unique experiences in surprisingly relatable ways, and with glimpses of the long and slow development of society as a whole. It uses sociological storytelling. One chapter will tell you, this guy was here on this night and had these conversations and felt this way about these things. Another chapter will begin, over the next 10 years, the people in the Southern Highlands began to zooming out and speeding up to watch society change in new and bizarre ways. It is a series whose main character is society, or perhaps humanity itself, whose central conflicts are our relationships to existence, nature, and the universe, and which manages to transition seamlessly from real components of contemporary political struggle to the lofty mechanics of pragmatically traversing the possible. It is a utopian story, and I want to explore that very deliberately, because I think that has immense value. As Ruth Levitas in her book Utopia as Method says,
defending utopia entails insisting that the identification and expression of the deepest desires of our hearts and minds, and those of others, is a necessary form of knowledge and of truth.
The Mars Trilogy shows us a possible liberatory future, not by taking us up to the moment revolution has succeeded and letting us imagine the rest, but by pushing way past, leaving capitalism behind, making it a mere hurdle we had to overcome to get out there into the universe, asking the really big questions. Solving deeper mysteries we can only really engage with when we, as humans, can look both beyond ourselves and deeper into ourselves with real understanding. I think utopian fiction is vital, not just as escapism, but as a way of communicating what makes struggle worthwhile. In collective struggle, imagination is crucial, and that's why I find this idea of life on other worlds to be the best argument for why leftists should care about space. It's not a pragmatic argument at all, but it's about our imagination. It's about our need to believe, to yearn, to dream. I often think about the HBO miniseries Chernobyl.
And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?
And the way the show lionizes scientists makes them the heroes of this story. Jared Harris's performance as Valery Legasov, in my opinion the finest of his career so far, includes these tender moments.
Fuel increases reactivity. Control rods and water reduce it. Steam increases it. The rise in temperature reduces it. This is the invisible dance that powers entire cities without smoke or flame. And it is beautiful.
Where, despite the urgency, the inconceivable pressure, the horror of his situation, his passion for scientific inquiry and discovery shines through. And I think those moments are essential to the emotional narrative of the series, where the obtuse bureaucracy of the state is the foil to the heroic love of truth of Legasov and the other scientists. I think that people who love the drama of science in Chernobyl will love the Mars trilogy for the same reason. Science is so integral to this series because it is the vehicle through which humanity is brought to consider itself, to understand its past, present, and future, to consider its direction and legacy. On the one hand, that makes scientific and technological aspects of the story a genre motif, like in so many other pieces of heavily political science fiction, a set of analogies and metaphors to tell a story about human freedom. On the other hand, real changes to what human beings can know and understand and change in the universe drive political transformations in a way that is true to history. Right now, we face an existential threat caused by capitalism that scientists have been trying to warn us about, and which must necessarily be solved, in part, by technological changes and scientific discovery, which will only be done if we collectively wrest control of our planetary future away from the ruling class. In turn, the ruling class is, and has for decades been trying, to eliminate the science, to epistemically dominate the world. They are trying to cloud the understanding and progress that new technologies have made possible, to choke any threats to their power. At the same time, developments in technology have brought us to a point where the quality of life for everyone on the planet could be higher than at any point in history if we were not constrained by a completely futile and defunct model of labour, of nations, of wealth, and of success. So we have an ecology being murdered by the greed of the ruling class. Half the people on the planet doing jobs they know are pointless just to get tiny, minute shares of imperialist plunder. The other half starving and struggling and straining to get by just day by day. The richest people in the world are working to produce ignorance and hatred on massive scales because they hope against hope that if they can lie enough, it will stop everyone from coming to the obvious conclusion: we gotta kill these fascist scumbags. So when I see Trump's second administration, with Elon Musk specifically in charge of so many of its pettiest and most egotistical, insecure horrors, like getting NASA to remove pages from their website that showed that women or people of colour ever had anything to do with space, it feels kind of obvious to me why we should care. They want to be the only ones who get to look up and dream. They want the sky to belong to them, and we won't let them. Which I guess brings us back around to the Mars trilogy. So let's talk about utopia, let's talk about revolution, let's talk about space for about as long as you'd probably expect in a piece of writing like this, and let's talk about old people having sex for way longer than anyone asked for. Poyekali.
Right out when the sun sets in my bedroom. I got a red room, it'll sit right out when the sun sets in my bedroom.
The Mars trilogy begins its future history epic with an international mission to send 100 colonists to Mars, 50 by NASA and 50 by the Russian Space Agency. The colonists are meticulously chosen first by their expertise and then their personalities as evaluated by a battery of psychological tests, and finally a year living in Antarctica to give them experience as close as possible to living on Mars. The two agencies build an enormous ship called the Ares in orbit, and it sets off with the first 100 people to live on Mars on board. On the journey out, deep in the inky void, with only each other and the whole world watching them, things for the colonists start to get weird. At first, it's everything you'd expect. Alliances form and break, jealousies simmer, tensions over what could be dismissed in any other setting as abstract or trivial differences become deeply pronounced. One group, the one in charge of the farming project, becomes insular and strange. The biggest personalities on board get tangled up in this little love triangle. Maya Toitovna, the leader of the Russian half of the mission, Frank Chalmers, the leader of the Americans, and Frank's best friend, John Boone, who isn't in an official leadership role, but was also the first person to set foot on Mars in a previous mission. The Christians on board make a point of celebrating Easter to the derision of the most staunchly atheist and scientific crew. A different 3 mission members form a love triangle in the cool way, where they're actually doing gay sex about it. All these happenings form the background radiation of the messy little lives of the first 100, floating along toward the red planet. But then, the solar storm hits, and everyone aboard has to hide in an onboard shelter to protect them from lethal radiation. This is a vital moment, because despite being in relatively close quarters and living and working together, this is the first time that all 100 of the colonists are in one place, and they get to talking. Cosmic circumstance has convened a citizens' assembly of the first 100, and some of them have an agenda. Arkady Bogdanov, an engineer who the crew psychologist assessed as entirely work-focused with no strong opinions, announces proudly that he lied the whole way through the selection process, and he knows everyone else did too, and everyone agrees. Arkady delivers a beautiful polemic to the first 100 about the moment they are experiencing in history and the opportunity they have before them. You know the drill. He's like, we can make society different than it currently is. Now, I'm no communist, but there's this great imagery in the storm shelter section because they're not in their usual artificial gravity from the rotating habitat rings, so they have to wear Velcro shoes to stick to the fabric surfaces, and Kim Stanley Robinson describes Arkady as ripping his way to the middle of the crowd. Arkady's ideas are popular, but they aren't wholly embraced by everyone aboard. There are very few actively reactionary oppositions to what he says, but something about this moment that underscores everyone's politics is that it opens up the topic of their right to Mars. This leads to more interrogation of the purpose of their mission before they even arrive at Mars, starting with Anne Claiborne, which is a great name for a geologist, right? Although technically on Mars, she's an areologist. Anne's objection is at first a professional one. If she's there to study the geological processes of Mars, then terraforming, which everyone suddenly seems to be in implicit agreement is happening, will make her work impossible and irrelevant. What was going to be the biggest leap forward for her discipline in history, just as it gets to be for everyone else aboard, will be snuffed out. Besides, she argues, if there is pre-existing Martian life, it could take years or perhaps decades to uncover it, and if terraforming starts right away, it may kill that Martian life before humans have a chance to find it. Sax Russell, the most autistic man who has ever lived in fiction or reality, and head of the proposed terraforming project, hand-waves away all her objections. And this leads to a heated argument which is watched on TV, live, by people all over Earth, rapidly polarizing them in a debate they didn't know they were having. A whole world of political thought spins out of this first objection, and a whole movement of people opposed to terraforming, who call themselves the Reds. The Reds have a whole spectrum of positions, from those who are vehemently against any changes to the planet at all, to those who think enough change to ease human habitation is good as long as their personal vision of the essential Mars is preserved. This isn't how they organise, though. They organise around specific issues. Some of them oppose the moholes, which are basically big vertical holes drilled into the planet's crust to get the heat from the core into the atmosphere. Some of them are opposed to the space elevator that the capitalists make to transport things to and from Earth. Some of them want to sever this umbilical cord to Earth, because it's a way that Earth exerts power over them, but some of them are worried that the elevator will be used to send too many people, and they'll destroy our way of life, and oh no, what if they send too many Chinese people and Indians? Some of the Reds are opposed to the Soletta, a big ring of space mirrors used to reflect more sunlight onto Mars to warm it faster, while others are specifically angry about the aerial lens, which focuses that light into a massive laser beam, carving canals a mile wide into the surface, which has every likelihood of making Mars too hot and basically permanently unbreathable, which is fine with the capitalists, because it would mean they can set up large-scale mining operations faster, and they don't care about Mars being for anything but profit. Some of the people in favour of changing Mars for human habitation also approach it from a very spiritual place. Hiroko Ai is the mastermind of the First 100's farming mission and ecological design. She holds the title of chief botanist, but it becomes quickly clear that she's also the leader of a growing cult. The Greens, as they will later be known, want to change Mars to be habitable for human beings, but also worship Mother Mars. They perform rituals where they dance together naked and eat handfuls of dirt. They believe in viriditas, a greening force, a life essence that spreads through all things, and they see themselves as helping viriditas to bloom. Hiroko takes the stored samples of the colonists' gametes from the Ares and makes a bunch of babies without telling anyone. She's my problematic fave, my revolutionary eco-warrior cum thief. Her children, raised in the cult, specifically in a hidden underground village that belongs to the cult, have names for the names of Mars, like Kasei and Nergal. I'm getting ahead of myself now. Nergal isn't born until after the First Revolution. The Greens are actually absent for a lot of Red Mars because their strength is in their underground networks growing like roots. As the population of Mars increases, members of the First 100 encounter people who have very spiritual beliefs about Mars, who take part in an evolving religious tradition coming to be known as the Areophany, a religion of Mars. There is a growing Arab population in the decades after the First 100 arrive, and some of the perspective characters meet Muslims who are incorporating Mars worship into their belief systems. At the same time that these political factions are developing, Arkadi's ideas are propagating in the population. The Bogdanovists sit in an odd third place relative to the Reds and the Greens. They engage in ecotage like the Reds, though the Bogdanovist motivation is in stopping Earth powers having control on Mars, and at the same time they believe in terraforming for human habitation like the Greens. When the Ares lands, part of it splits to go to Phobos, the moon of Mars, where Arkady and his team spend the first few years of the mission working on a spaceport so that traffic to and from the Red Planet can navigate the gravity well more easily. Arkady and his closest comrades, being big believers in public luxury and human progress, make the stop at Phobos as beautiful as possible. Every single detail has been considered in terms of design, aesthetic, function, and more. Arkady's stated goal with the construction on Phobos is that it will give newcomers the best possible first impression of Mars and of the way that humanity is changing as it steps into an interplanetary future. Phobos becomes redundant as a spaceport when the capitalists and UNOMA, United Nations Office of Martian Affairs, set up the Space Elevator, a cable spooled out of the asteroid Clark by minor factory robots connected to the surface in an aerostationary orbit, with the cable swinging slightly but precisely to avoid the orbits of Mars's two moons. Though Phobos may be less relevant, Arkady's ideas are not, and Bogdanovists appear at every level of Martian society, concentrated most in organized labor and Bogdanovist enclaves. As tensions grow between the Martian factions and UNOMA, there is a rumor one of the Bogdanovist hubs even has its own nuclear weapons. The final long-term factor in all of this is the gerontological treatments. The queer throuple from the First 100 develop a series of treatments which, if reapplied every few years, can potentially prolong someone's life indefinitely. This is why so much of these books are about old people fucking. I don't mean like middle-aged. I mean there's a scene where a 150-year-old man who is described as looking like a gnome has sex with an 8-foot-tall native Martian cat girl. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Politically, who can and cannot access the gerontological treatments is a big deal. Firstly, because on Earth, unlike on Mars, there are whole classes or even countries of people who can't afford it. But secondly, because after access to the gerontological treatments does start to even out, there's a population explosion because people just aren't dying of old age anymore. All of these factions and their disagreements, the growing disdain for UNOMA and the transnational corporations ruling Earth, the tension around the gerontological treatments and terraforming, constitute the powder keg that is Martian politics going into the 2060s. There is no one thing that kicks off the first revolution clearly. Workers go on strike, terraforming facilities are sabotaged, tents that provide the life support shielding for towns or villages are slashed. These things become the everyday events, and things just escalate and escalate until fighting breaks out. The chapters around the revolution of 2061 are chaos. Communications are blacked out, characters bump into each other and trade gossip about where they last saw this person or that. The basic understanding of whether the Martian forces or Unoma are winning is anyone's guess, and then the Bogdanovists bring down the elevator cable. Clark Asteroid, which acts as a counterweight to hold the cable in place, is detached and zooms off into the void. The cable stays standing for a short time, the umbilical cord to Earth cut, but the separation not truly realized. And then there comes a little wobble. Then, with incredible destructive force, the cable crashes down to Mars, wrapping more than 2 times fully around the equator and pulverizing everything under its path. Many die, including Arkady. The falling cable does not distinguish based on ideology. Further fighting causes dust storms, landslides, floods. Any hope of an untouched red Mars is completely lost. The horrendous violence of the Revolution of 61 severs Mars from Earth's control, stalling terraforming, stalling development, and giving the underground space to rebuild. But it also traumatizes the hell out of all the main characters. Going into Green Mars, there is a felt desperation to be able to talk things out peacefully as much as possible. This is where Nergal, one of Hiroko's weird children, and Art Randolph, a diplomat from Earth who joins the Underground, come together with Nadia to facilitate the Dorsa Bravia Conference. Basically, Art, who the books describe as a happy little bear of a man, is taken in by Hiroko's people and immediately witnesses that none of the Martian factions can work together, even though they agree on quite a lot. This conference immediately shows how much everyone agrees on, capitalism is bullshit, Mars should be controlled democratically, everyone should have a good basic standard of living. The Reds register a plethora of small groups so they can have more votes overall in the conference. Hiroko appears naked and painted green and descends into a pool in the middle of Dorsa Bravia. I love her, I love her, I love her, I love her, I love her. All this talking and figuring out and arguing and agreeing puts the Martians in a much stronger place, so that the second revolution in Green Mars is much more peaceful. The organized forces of Martian politics are simply overwhelmingly stronger than Earth powers on Mars at this point. The UN Transitional Authority, replacing Unoma after the disaster of 61, is not as strong and not in a good position to negotiate from. At the same time, Earth is experiencing climate disasters that are putting it in a state of disabling crisis. Out of the Dorsa Bravia Conference, the biggest political party in the new landscape of what will become Martian electoral politics, the Free Mars Party, is formed. Nergal and his long-term on-off lover Jackie, the granddaughter of John Boone, become the figureheads of Free Mars. But over the following decades, Nergal and the kind of liberatory, open, collectivist politics he represents gets slowly sidelined and marginalized. With terraforming practically finished, a new antagonism emerges as Free Mars becomes Mars First, a political strain dedicated to keeping down immigration from Earth. Jackie uses the opportunity of Nergal going to Earth as part of a Martian delegation to see how they can help to consolidate power around this more reactionary agenda. As we know, the only thing that can stop a bad girl with borderline personality disorder is a worse older Russian woman with borderline personality disorder, so naturally Maya Toitovna pulls some horrendous Machiavelli shit, and Jackie basically loses corporeal form. With humanity entering a new age of collaboration, discovery, and expansion, Mars moves past this isolationist phase and into a utopian future. The debate around terraforming forms the central political conflict for most of the trilogy, and the original kernel for the story. Kim Stanley Robinson originally wrote several short stories collected as a novella titled Green Mars, set in a similar but separate timeline where Mars is being settled and terraformed. One of the characters, Roger Claiborne, is a geologist who questions the nature of their settling and colonization of Mars. Kim Stanley Robinson said of the novella,
"Yes, I wrote that mainly to stake a claim, at least a moral claim, on the name. I thought Green Mars was such a good name, such an obvious name. And when I heard about Olympus Mons, this enormous volcano, I just had to write about climbing it."
In the Mars trilogy, the issue of terraforming sits at a comfortable enough distance from real politics to not feel like a direct analogy to anything in particular, while close enough and complex enough to explore lots of very real social conflicts and also drive the plot. Let's walk through some examples. If I were to compare terraforming to climate change, it would prima facie strike us as very apt. They are changing the climate. The problem, of course, is it's a perfectly inside-out version of climate change, where the ruling class and the profit incentive and modern science and technology are on the side of making the planet more habitable, at least to a certain degree anyway. If I were to compare it to settler colonialism, well, the Reds are trying to preserve what came before, arguing that Earth people have no right to change Mars to conform to their needs. Morally, this is an interesting argument, but it's deeply uncompelling to most people. Even if you believe quite strongly in the right of the cosmos to go unchanged, it's hard to argue that has a greater moral weight than human life, and it really, really doesn't measure up to the right of indigenous people not to be exterminated, enslaved, or culturally erased by settler colonists. If I compared terraforming to nuclear power, the analogy would be that both are new and developing technologies with huge potential benefits for human beings, but also catastrophic risks. If terraforming went wrong, it could not only change Mars, but leave it uninhabitable for living things as well. In this sense, this is the best direct analogy. It doesn't have its own glaring problems as a metaphor, but it leaves out all the other political elements that are present around terraforming. Nuclear power isn't like climate change or colonialism in the ways terraforming is, but also terraforming isn't like any of them in ways that are unique. It also is like all of them in some ways. It's its own thing. It's important that Anne's passion for rocks comes across to the reader, not just through this lady who keeps telling the other colonists, it's not dust, it's technically called fines. But instead, by actually getting us to see the beauty and the complexities of Mars even before there is life all over it. Because of this, geology is very important to the Mars trilogy. When you read these books, you should be ready for Kim Stanley Robinson to spend an incredible amount of time showing you his special interest in rocks. Like, the books stop every half a chapter or so to throw a little party for how interesting and fun the rocks are. I'm so sorry to Mae Jemison, whose astronaut photo I used to make this terrible geology meme. As the first black woman in space, people deserve to know your face and name. I've already mentioned the book Half-Earth Socialism, which is definitely a text that sits in the same eco-socialist worldview as the Mars trilogy, but I want to also say that the terraforming debate in these books always really reminds me of the Half-Earth Socialism game. There's a really neat little browser game at play.half.earth where you unlock and apply cards representing policies in order to try and make the planet habitable while not getting yourself assassinated for changing everything too fast. The same friend who introduced me to the Mars trilogy said to me at some point that Blue Mars is a book for the people who really enjoyed the Dorsa Bravia conference, where they outlined the basics of their politics and constitution and wanted a whole book about that. I think Blue Mars is the book that's the most like playing the Half-Earth game, even though it's also the book where terraforming is the most concluded, probably because the premise of the game is that there has been a global revolution that's put you in place as world leader, dedicated to stopping climate change, and Blue Mars takes us from the final stages of revolution to the final utopian vision of the series. I think that speaks to a current throughout the story of this kind of play, I suppose, which is the complex puzzle of convening the scientific and social through politics. As always happens in political movements, the characters in the books adopt mantras and slogans, and one thing they say repeatedly is, we are terraforming Mars, but Mars is also terraforming us, which then becomes, we terraform Mars, but Mars areoforms us. This is fun wordplay because where terraform means for us to make the land how we want, or to make it Earth-like specifically, areoformation is something done to us. Areoformation is always the process of becoming Martian. Watching the diversity of positions and ideologies among the Reds grow outward and then clash and combine and form new syntheses with the Greens and Bogdanovists, battle with the forces of Earth and blossom out again into new shapes is the core success of the sociological storytelling of these books. They capture the fractal evolution of culture and politics and thought over time. As we terraform Mars, Mars also areoforms us.
Nergal goes to Earth in one chapter of Blue Mars and travels around to lots of different places.
One of the things I find really charming in the books is this point in mid-terraformation where the planet isn't so cold that they have to wear big chunky spacesuits anymore. The atmosphere is roughly the right pressure and temperature, but they obviously can't breathe it, so everyone's able to go outside in normal clothes and respirators. I don't know why that appeals to me, a planet that's on the way to habitable. It says about people giving each other little kisses by just bonking their masks together. Nergal goes to Earth in one of the chapters of Blue Mars. He travels around lots of different places and experiences this wild culture shock. He's not the first Martian-born Martian to go to Earth, but he is seen as special, as a child of the First 100, someone raised by Hiroko, and a leader of the Free Mars movement. His body struggles constantly under the greater gravity, and he's almost always overwhelmed by the loud sounds and all the colours and the air quality. He's just like me for real. At the end of his travels on Earth, he goes diving in a flooded town in the UK, and a bit of floodwater gets in his mouth, and he gets horribly sick. The only way he can be saved is being rushed back to Mars, where he won't be fighting an infinite horde of new pathogens, as well as struggling to breathe, as well as being crushed by Earth G. Nergal drinks some Britain and nearly dies immediately. That's so real. Our government literally decided to dump so much sewage in our waterways, we have a brown aura visible from space. As a trans woman living in the UK in 2025, I feel like that decision really manifested something deeply true about this wretched island. It is important to understand the terraforming issue because it is the most significant material political question for most of the story and the framework within which the political conflict is all happening, but also because it becomes a reflexive metaphor for our own human journey toward utopia. There is a beautiful core idea in the terraforming debate to do with our willingness to leave behind what we have had and been as we step forward into the future and keep ourselves open to the possibility of being changed in ways we don't expect. The third book of the trilogy sees more and more fall into place more peacefully until characters are concerning themselves only with the final questions of how long human beings should live and how to ensure the best experience of life possible, sitting and watching as day by day the sky of Mars is a slightly different red, and then a slightly different red, and then a slightly different purple, and at last, a blue Mars. One of my favourite features of the moon are these what are called ray systems, lines spreading out from a crater. I love them because you can see exactly what happened. Something hit the moon, and then dust was thrown from the impact in every direction. I got a bit obsessed once I saw how much detail I could see of the moon. Once I realised I could see so much of it, I decided to make composite shots of all her different phases. As the waxing moon progresses, the lunar maria, the oceans, are revealed, though they're not actual oceans. Huge basins of rock that formed as lava flows filled massive impact craters. When the Soviets sent the first probes to orbit the moon, the first time in human history that we laid eyes on the far side of a truth evident in our reality from the beginning, it was immediately obvious that the far side is much more cratered than the face we usually see. Apparently this is not because that side has had more impacts, but because it has a thicker crust. The Luna 3 probe also spotted a number of lunar maria on the far side, though generally smaller, and the Soviets named one of them Mare Moscoviense, as in the Moscow Sea. This ran against naming conventions and was critiqued as a chauvinistic thing to name a lunar feature, but it was accepted after French astronomer Audouin Dollfus proclaimed that Moscow is a state of mind. The moon is roughly 400 times smaller than the sun, but by incredible coincidence, the sun is also 400 times further away from us, which is why they look about the same size in the sky. The nature of this coincidence is, well, astronomical. They match so precisely. The moon is smaller optically than the sun for most of the month, but ever so slightly bigger at its periapsis. Not only that, but the moon moves about 4 centimeters further away from us every year, meaning she is only this big in our skies for a short time and never ever will be again. The whole of human history has taken place within the age of the perfect eclipse. When the first 100 get to Mars, they have to live in rovers most of the time. They're these pretty cool scientific research caravans with a folding bellows in the middle, mobile homes for exploring a currently uninhabitable world. Eventually, they construct a series of partially submerged buildings, and it becomes a settlement called Underhill. Life in Underhill is described as mostly happy and work-focused, but they're still the only 100 people on an entire planet, and their options are either being all confined to a pretty small space together, or go out. Way, way out into the frozen, rocky expanse. As a result, most of the characters spend most of their time in rovers in Red Mars, and a lot of Green Mars too. Day after day, even year after year, they roll across Mars, exploring, researching, terraforming the planet, and being areoformed by it. However cramped and simultaneously lonely all these characters are, and the complete historical uniqueness of what they're going through, and the constant high stakes of everyday work are dire conditions for their mental health that are in place for years and years. This was the plan in the first place, in fact. It was always going to be like this, and that's obvious, which is why Michelle, the mission's psychologist, repeatedly proclaims it was futile to try to select sane candidates in the first place. They may as well send mad people. They were all going to go mad anyway. Nadia is a great example here. Nadia, the group's lead engineer, is perhaps the most sane among them, because she just lives to fix and build things. And then as a result, she winds up horribly overworked because she's doing everything for everyone all the time. But being the queen of just spacing the fuck out and listening to jazz seems to get her through most of it. Until the workload and Maya wanting to talk about her love triangle situationship distracts her, and she winds up having an industrial accident and losing a finger. Michelle, the psychologist's perspective chapters are mostly about how he misses Provence and he wishes he could be having sex with all the women he's treating, most especially Maya. Michelle is an incurably H&H FTM, homesick and horny French-type man. He is increasingly absent thinking about Marseille all the time, unless he's listening to Maya talking about her feelings, and he's utterly besotted with her. Then eventually they do actually get together, which feels like the conclusion of Michelle even gesturing towards being a responsible therapist. However, to be fair to Monsieur Duval, they've been living on Mars already for decades and engaging in revolutionary struggle together, and I don't think he's actually been employed as a psychologist for a really long time at that point. His real moment of departure from trying to keep the first 100 sane is also much earlier than that, when he leaves Underhill with Hiroko and the farm team. Michelle, being the mission psychologist, compounds the futility of trying to flatten and regularize human beings. Even the guy they sent to keep everyone else normal is too mentally ill to care even a little bit, and too French and horny to do his job. Maya's other two love interests are John Boone, the first man on Mars, and Frank Chalmers, the Machiavellian political schemer who basically wheeled and dealed the whole first 100 colonist mission into existence in the first place. Frank is an awful, self-destructive, toxic shell of a man. His life fell apart when he was trying to organize a massive welfare program for Americans in poverty, and then the funding was suddenly cut. His marriage fell apart, and he drank and he stewed, and he turned into this sort of political robot set on realizing the most absurd dreams of willful ambition just to feel seen by history out of spite. He resents John not just for dating Maya after him, but because his whole plan was to use John's gregarious, Boy Scoutish charisma to get the whole program together, let John be the first man on Mars, and then have control over the colony mission. But John joined as one of the first 100 at the last minute, naturally pulling everything away from Frank with his easy, likable charm. And that's why Frank has John killed. Frank engineers a plot to have John assassinated in the midst of a riot that he himself incites by lying to the growing Arab population on Mars that all Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment on Mars traces back to John. This is several decades into Mars colonization, but it's literally the first chapter of the series. After this, it jumps back in time. There is something Shakespearean about the brother murder that precedes the Martian Revolution, Frank's betrayal and loss of the person who understands him best because of his own insurmountable jealousy and rage. Despite being very different at first glance, Frank and John are similar characters in some very core ways, and that makes their friendship feel emotionally legible. It's not just that they've been in each other's lives a long time, even before Mars. It's that they both live totally immersed in the charismatic world of politics, and while Frank's inner world is spiteful and plotting, John's is still quite similarly dissociated. John's perspective chapter talks about how he knows that when people look at him, they only ever see the first man on Mars. He says it's like he put on that fishbowl astronaut helmet, and he never really got to take it off. I think it's a feat in and of itself that John is one of the best characters when his position as the first man on Mars consumes his character so much. His first words on Mars are, "Well, here we are," which feels very intentionally based on Poyekala, Yuri Gagarin's "Here we go." And he reads as a little Gagarin, a little Armstrong, and also a little Johnny Appleseed or Paul Bunyan. John Boone is probably named after Daniel Boone, pioneer, frontiersman, and folk hero, especially the ways that the italicized sections at the start of each chapter frequently tell myths and popular stories that are circulating in Martian culture with no obvious narrator. Some of these are about John himself. Some of them are about the Little Red People, who are Martian borrowers, basically. Some of them are about Big Man, a giant who shaped the Martian landscape. One of them is about Paul Bunyan, mythical American lumberjack, coming to Mars and getting beaten up by Big Man and dissolving into bacteria that form the basis of Martian life. One of the stories that I love about John that gets told is he's on a train to Burroughs at some point, one of the biggest cities on Mars, and there's this woman with some kind of facial deformity, and when she goes into the next carriage, one of the guys in the carriage starts slagging her off, saying, how ugly she is, and John knocks the guy onto the floor and says, "There is no such thing as an ugly woman." Where were we? Names. There are lots of references in how Kim Stanley Robinson names characters. Arkady Bogdanov, the revolutionary firebrand, for example, is named after Arkady Strugatsky and Alexander Bogdanov, both Soviet science fiction writers. Bogdanov was a Bolshevik revolutionary, a doctor and a philosopher, and Arkady Strugatsky was one of the two brothers who wrote the Noon stories, science fiction classics from the Soviet Union that basically everyone in the USSR would know. Maya Toitovna is named after a character from the Noon books, Maya Toivovna Glumova. Nadia, who I adore and am in love with in a way I've never felt for any other fictional character and want to marry and have babies with, is Nadia Chernyshevsky, like the Russian critic Nikolai Chernyshevsky, but also since she's Arkady's long-term partner and Arkady is this sort of Marx-adjacent, Lenin-adjacent figure, she's probably also named after Lenin's wife, Nadia Krupskaya. You could go on and on digging through the references, but it's quite a nice way that KSR makes the stories rhyme with history and with other classic works of science fiction. Speaking of which, there's a character involved in developing the gerontological treatments called Ursula Cole, like Ursula K. When KSR isn't using inspiration from science fiction writers or historical figures, his names for characters have a poetic ring to them. Anne Claiborne, as I've said, is one of the best examples of that. It's a little on the nose, but you need to understand the iconoclast that this geologist come areologist is going to be, so why not name her Anne from the Soil? I like it. Phyllis Boyle, one of the antagonists, is called Boyle. She's got an ugly name because she's got an ugly soul. Frank Chalmers, who as far as I can tell isn't named after anyone in particular, just has a perfectly politician-ish name. It's focus grouped. Inoffensive. Kim Stanley Robinson really understands that idea that there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. Okay, sorry, no, I have to. This is a dreadful tangent, but I just found out recently that quote doesn't come from Lenin, as people say it does. It gets bandied around as a Lenin quote, but it was actually quite reworked and paraphrased, and a version of something Lenin said. The actual formulation, "there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen," came from, of all people, George Galloway, the Putin-supporting, COVID misinfo-spreading anti-trans conspiracy theorist. Heartbreaking, most tedious fedora-wearing pseudo-communist you know had an absolute banger quote one time. Anyway, this idea that time stretches and warps is really interesting, and I think as soft animals living in a world of immanent spirits, but being told that everything has to be rigid and machine-like, we have a felt sense that this is true. No matter what capitalist commodification tells us, time does not exist in discrete and uniform chunks. Sometimes nothing happens for a really long time, and sometimes everything happens all at once, and Kim Stanley Robinson shows a very canny understanding of this. When the first 100 get to Mars, they need to agree on a standard to resolve the fact that the Martian day is cosmologically longer than the Terran day by about 39 minutes. And they decide to just have 39 minutes in the middle of the night where all the clocks stop. It's called the time slip. There just isn't time during those 39 minutes. They just aren't in time. As the series progresses, this ends up being a time, or I guess a non-time, where a lot of interesting, unusual, revolutionary, or Areophonic plot points happen. Someone tells a story of an orgy the whole work crew of a mining rig have during the time slip. Underground rebels stage a prison break during the time slip. The farm team holds a ritual worshipping the planet, and the next day have disappeared without a trace. Kim Stanley Robinson uses perspective chapters in, I think, a quite clever way. The story will make statements of fact that it trusts you as the reader to intuit are actually the opinions of characters whose chapter it is. But it doesn't say, Frank thought this. It just says it. This puts the reader in the position of quasi-historian, trying to derive something cohesive from these people's differing, often contradictory, messy experiences. The series starts in possibly the best way to key readers into this, because the first chapter of Red Mars is Frank's perspective as he's orchestrating the plot to have John killed. We hear a lot of plainly stated justifications and rationales for why this is the right thing to do, and this has to happen. And it feels like we're inside Frank's mind, sitting uncomfortably close, listening to him, telling himself the story of his own life. The story might make a comment about primate dominance hierarchies between people, and we're reading it like, I don't know, bro, you're in the process of murdering your best friend. I'm not sure monkeys is where your head should be at. Frank is a great character for keying into this in general, actually, because he's got bangers like, no one can really read facial expressions, that's fake. But it becomes clearer and clearer as you read that every fact in the series is actually the fact stated as perceived by the character whose chapter it is. When Maya starts experiencing memory loss and trauma flashbacks, for example, the story doesn't say, Maya forgot this thing that you remember. It says something like, Maya looked at a picture of a man, but you can infer from the context that it's someone she used to know and has forgotten. I do need to say, most of the perspective chapters are from the perspective of white characters. There are 2 non-white perspective characters, and they're actually both native Martians, so it's not like KSR was writing from the perspective of a person of colour as they exist in the real-world context of a white supremacist society today. Like, the whole series is trying to envision a deliberately multicultural melting pot future, and elements of non-white cultures become vital to Martian culture and way of life, but this also decontextualizes them. The most striking indication of this is when Nergal goes to Earth. He's welcomed as a descendant of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and he hears steel drum music, and he says, wow, they have Martian music here. In Red Mars, the first generation of people on Mars are mostly white, and by Blue Mars, most people born on Mars come into a practically post-racial society. The intentions are positive, but there are some real clangers in there, in the sorts of ways you'd expect from a white leftist sci-fi writer 30 years ago. The frequent foregrounding of sex and sexuality in these books is a strength, in my opinion, but there are times when women of colour are sexualized in ways that white women would not be, and given how the perspective chapters are written, you could write this off as white characters' biases showing through, but it would be a lot easier to make that claim if we ever saw whiteness from the outside. While I'm on sexuality, sexual orientation does something similar to race, in that there is one gay relationship in the first 100, but by Blue Mars, the first 100's grandkids are having drug-fueled pansexual orgies and using CRISPR to edit their DNA to turn them into catgirls and shit. Like, good for them. It just feels like KSR maybe lowballed how many gay astronauts there would be in the first place, and like he doesn't really care that much to explore queer people's actual perspectives. Sometimes KSR really succeeds at creating this vision of a multicultural post-capitalist society, and sometimes it feels limited in the ways that Star Trek The Next Generation feels limited. Those sorts of ways that aren't obvious until you watch Deep Space Nine. I'd really love for there to be a story set in the world of these books about black characters on Mars that shows us that white supremacy isn't something that just magically melts away as soon as the material conditions improve. Because we all know that it wouldn't. Coyote, actual name Desmond, is a Caribbean man and the only black person aboard the Ares. He isn't in the first 100, he's a stowaway, and he's Hiroko's secret boyfriend that she's brought along with the farm equipment because he's part of her secret plans for the farm team and the Areophony. This is right here in the books. Like, the first black man on Mars was brought across in a way that feels deliberately reminiscent of chattel slavery. And this doesn't go completely unexplored. Desmond talks about how Hiroko bringing him across like that put him at the low end of a very extreme power dynamic, and he remains one of the most pessimistic and cynical of the first colonists throughout the series. But just like many other cultural and racial politics in the books, it feels like something KSR started to approach and then left unfinished. Also, in quite classic American atheist fashion, most Muslims in the story are part of a very conservative culture that is problematic for the emergent progressive culture of Mars, but Sufis get a load of praise because they're into science and academia, and aspects of Sufism become part of the Areophany. Someone get Edward Said on the line, we're staging an intervention. Culture is not a monolith, but rather comprises the infinitesimal interactions of individuals, many of them reverent or explicitly positive, but contributing to harmful processes like Orientalism. Also, I don't know, dog, white people are racist. I don't think I need to make an explanation or apology for it. I can just say this is a part of the books that make me cringe. On the other hand, I do think Kim Stanley Robinson broadly writes women quite well. There are a lot of great female characters right from the start. For one, Maya Toitovna, the leader of the Russian half of the First 100. Maya is such a messy bitch, and it makes so much sense. From the outside, you see a woman making lots of terrible decisions, but then in her perspective chapters, it makes sense. They're terrible decisions, but you know why she's making them. On the journey out, when she sleeps with Frank and then John, internally she's like, well, I like sex, and I like having sex, and these people will enjoy having sex with me, so we should just have a nice time together. And she just doesn't understand how it will be seen from the outside, or the tensions it will cause, and she's just like me for real. Nadia and Anne are really similar characters on paper, two women very focused on their respective engineering and scientific fields to an extent that they can be almost degendering or masculinizing, but in practice they are strikingly different people. Nadia is affable, romantic, eager to help everyone get everything done and built and fixed and working from the moment they arrive on Mars, whereas Anne is the queen of saying no to everything. I really like this. They feel like real people I've met in real life, and at times I feel like I've been both of them. And speaking of people I feel like I've met in real life, not all of KSR's well-written women are protagonists. There's also Phyllis Boyle, the first 100 colonist who becomes the face of Earth powers on Mars, overseeing the elevator cable and getting filthy rich in the process. Phyllis is the fucking worst, and in a very believable way, where everything awful about her comes back to the same drive to be upwardly socially mobile. And I've absolutely met this person several times. I live in London, what do you expect? Zoe is another great female character that the series uses to explore the political world of the more isolationist native Martians. Zoe is the great-granddaughter of members of the First 100, raised in the Dorsabravian matriarchy. I think a lot of male sci-fi writers would probably either write about a matriarchy like, it will be perfect and fix everything, or it will be just like patriarchy but with vaginas instead, or even worse, just look at all these sexy women in spacesuits. And KSR has the courage here to say that as an intentional reorganization against patriarchy, it is quite a lot better, but Zoe still has a lot of chauvinistic female supremacist thoughts that are clearly the product of a failure to interrogate power properly. Overall, the use of character perspectives imparts a way of understanding characters that only becomes more pertinent and powerful through the series. Everybody is living in a false world inside their own heads, and the person they are in there interacts with that world, and that is fundamentally divorced from the outside them interacting with the outside world. That's very real, actually. And given that these characters live like 200 years, the way that their perception shapes the stories they're telling about themselves creates incompatible versions of personal history that shape how they remember, or eventually fail to remember, their lives. KSR's understanding of mental health is very poignant.
You got your three elves, right? Your physical elf, your dental elf, your mental elf, and that's you. Everything else is just taking care of other people's elves.
I think the implicit framework of mind and experience that these perspective chapters gives us makes the evolution of each character's psychology make total sense. Maya's internal story of herself is incredibly volatile and erratic until she can only remember the things that made her feel the most intense feelings. Anne has a lot of bad shit happen to her for a long time, and she starts going into long periods of fugue and eventually tells Sax she's developed another personality she thinks of as Auntie Anne, and a third alter ego as well she doesn't fully understand. That feels like how her mind would make sense of her life. Frank is a hollow rage monster who thinks that all joy is folly and all hope is weakness because his dreams were crushed, so he needs for everyone else's dreams to be bullshit too. John goes around giving speeches to crowds, and he just dissociates through the whole thing being beautiful and charismatic, and then people clap, but actually, he's really struggling under the surface. A really interesting study in this is the evolving psychology of Sax Russell, the best science boy in the whole series. Sax starts out as a character who is very work-focused and somewhat unfeeling, struggling to understand why everyone else isn't as excited about all the science as he is. He is still characterized in this. It is discussed how reclusive and work-obsessed he is. People start telling a mean joke behind his back about how he's actually 100 super smart lab rats that got turned into a guy in an experiment gone wrong. And that feels shitty. But for the most part, Sax at the start seems like a character who exists so KSR can share his special interests through the mouthpiece of a socially awkward nerd with the biggest state research budget since the Manhattan Project. Then, in Green Mars, after Sax has been a part of the underground resistance for a while, he gets plastic surgery and fake documents and goes undercover back into the research labs. Here, he doesn't just roleplay, but completely inhabits his new persona as Stephen Lindholm. When he's Stephen, he acts confidently, he knows how to be charming, he even has Stephen Lindholm thoughts in his head, but when he's Sax, he's Sax. In other words, his undercover mission taught him how to mask. But crucially, he and Stephen Lindholm don't want the same things. Stephen starts a relationship with Phyllis Boyle, of all people, who Sax despises. Clearly there is something here that is dissociative beyond the way most people experience neurodivergent masking going on. Then, skipping ahead a little, Sax gets captured and tortured by fascists and he suffers serious brain damage, which his comrades are able to help with using experimental new treatments related to the gerontological treatments aimed at enhancing neuroplasticity. In essence, Sax recovers into a new version of himself, pulling together old parts to become something different. One way that Sax becomes a lot more Stephen Lindholm-like as he changes is that he's a lot more romantically successful. It might be funny to imagine a man in his 130s becoming a ladies' man, but the Mars Trilogy wouldn't be the Mars Trilogy without so much old people fucking. Hell yeah, old people fucking. It's time to talk about old people fucking. The first 100 are in their 40s or 50s when they're having polyamorous shenanigans aboard the Ares. The gerontological treatments work by repairing vital processes that usually wind down throughout life and combating ailments that usually cut life short, but they don't make everyone 25 again. These people are healthy and strong, but they're still aging, albeit more slowly. I'm going to be really for real about this for a second and say our society has a problem with the fetishization of the youth to the degree that I just used old people fucking as a self-contained setup punchline a bunch of times in this video. Old people have sex. I want to talk about it. One of the central conservative and patriarchal ideas in our society is marriage between a man and a woman, one and only, nobody else ever, 2.5 kids, and a dog and a cat and a white picket fence. I want to speak to my carabiner-wearing audience for a second and say, imagine you had 200 years, maybe 300. Imagine having all that time to live a life with partners who become family, become your closest and oldest friends, as well as lovers. With all those years to share, there would be some times you would want to spend apart, sometimes you would want to spend with others, sometimes you would want to spend seeing each other often, but not living together. Life is long, and you can take it slowly. It's beautiful, right? Maya and John have this passionate, crazy, limerent, intense romance that could never possibly work in a domestic routine. They argue, they fall out, they part ways, they yearn for each other terribly, they travel, they grow, they come together again. The power throuple, Vlad, Ursula, and Marina, have their own little 3-person utopia just working on their writing and research. 2 beautiful lesbians keeping a pet man. That's how I choose to interpret the relationship for personal reasons. Anne and Sax are clearly completely nuts about each other, but they need literally 170 years to work through all their personality issues and baggage and trauma in order to be together. And they get to. I would be keen to defend any degree of sexuality in art. I'm a firm believer that porn is art. But just to be clear, for anyone interested in reading these books about what you're getting into, KSR is a lot more graphic and explicit describing rocks than he is sex. At the same time, I do think it's fascinating how these characters connect on an interpersonal and political level. There's a line that makes me absolutely shudder where Maya is talking about Frank's eyes after they have sex, and she says it's like looking in the windows of an empty house. There's also loads of really interesting writing about the future sexually liberated culture of generations of Martians. Native Martians grow up under a weaker gravity, so they're all like 8 feet tall, and they figure out ways to edit their biology and change themselves. Hey, Kim Stanley Robinson, you know what would have been a really cool type of person you could have included in this part that really would have like fit well with what you were trying to do here? Okay, never mind. I already feel seen as a cat girl. At the same time that their physicality is different, native Martians have a polyamorous, pansexual dating culture. It feels like their different physicality and sexuality is an interleaved, reflexive metaphor. Sex is important to people and is an important way that people relate to and understand one another. And seeing characters who live for such a long time, so have such intense and specific baggage, relate to each other in this way is fantastic. And the series is a lot stronger for having so much old people fucking. There's this beautiful section about Nadia and Arkady flying around on a blimp together. They're traveling Mars, dropping off these heater turbines very early in the story as one of the first approved terraforming procedures. But it turns out Sachs has hidden little lichen in the units. He wants to completely circumvent all discussion and start spreading life on the surface right away. Despite this, Nadia and Arkady are having a wonderful time, reunited for the first time properly since the Ares. They're just hanging out, not bothering to get dressed, in between bouts of passionate lovemaking, the way you do in some relationships when you know you're not going to need to see anyone but your beloved for a sustained time. It's such a joyous chapter, and the way these two very serious and practical-minded people become silly, happy, soft creatures in each other's arms is so beautiful to me. For me, Nadia and Arkady is one of the persevering images of romance in the series, but there are many. Another favourite of mine is John and Maya right after their first gerontological treatments, feeling odd and tender and beginning to experience the regenerative effects, sitting in a sauna together, contemplating all the decades they could now have together that they never knew they would. It describes them as being pink like newborn babies, and I actually think about it basically any time I'm in a sauna. These books have so many fascinating characters having very real-feeling relationships and growing as people in ways that speak to so much about the human condition, which is why the end of the trilogy being so preoccupied with memory and memory loss and death fits so well. They lived through a lot, and then they started to forget parts of it. And then the series ends with every remaining first 100 taking acid together. Okay, this is Sachs's final triumph. He creates a treatment which supposedly will refire all the memories in the brain at once, allowing people to relive their lives and make new sense of it, turning it into a pattern that can hold, because without it, people have been forgetting more and more, and the Super Age has been going into something called the quick decline, which I don't think KSR ever actually says this, but basically it's dying of a broken heart. Anyway, they all agree to take Sachs's drugs, so they go to Underhill together and take part in this big collective remembering. And it works. They get a better grip on what's happened to them and are able to tell their own stories again. And then things are just kind of chill. Like, they know at some point soon-ish they're going to die off, but they can make peace with that because they have this new understanding of themselves and of their lives. I said it's not an acid trip, and it's technically not an acid trip, but reading the description of it all as a woman of psychedelic experience, I was like, yes, that's an acid trip. Like, KSR did a cheeky little tab, and he wants to tell us about what if all his OCs did a cheeky little tab together, and it's great. I honestly wish more stories ended like this. But I guess that's some of the advantage of utopian fiction. They've solved all their shit, and they're free now. The last remaining antagonism is just about how we live and how we approach death. It shows us that the reward for the struggle is being able to move on to the bigger, deeper questions. To me, that's the best possible motivation we could have to figure out what is to be done. Mars, when humanity expands across the solar system, one chapter explores life on Mercury. Mercurian politics is bizarre, like a fuel-rich desert city-state because the planet is so close to the sun, and people have figured out by this point how to transmit stored energy huge distances, and of course because Mercury is far too hot to be habitable. The only city on Mercury rides a huge monorail around the top of the planet to remain permanently in the dawn twilight. When people do go down on the surface walks, they sometimes experience a kind of solar mania. Something in our monkey brains seeing the sun so much bigger than usual, and we flood with dopamine and we just have to run full pelt towards it. Honestly, looking through a telescope at the sun, solar mania makes so much sense. The beauty of our star, the nuclear mother of all life on Earth, shouldn't be so shocking, but the sun is simply magnificent. Now, if seeing the Earth turning was impressive, seeing the sun, moon, and Earth all come into partial alignment and then just as suddenly fall out of it again is positively dizzying. When we had a partial eclipse at the end of March this year, I made some composite shots, and what really caught my eye were the sunspots. Sunspots are the paired points on the sun's surface where unusual loops of magnetic flux connect to the star. When you see them side on, they look a bit like a little dimple, because the particles in the flux tube are more cool and transparent. This dimplish appearance is called the Wilson effect. I decided to watch the Wilson effect unfold by taking more pictures of the sun, and I was surprised to see, in 3 photos taken 3 days apart each, that the same group of sunspots moved a little over a quarter of a way around the sun. This meant the surface of the sun must be spinning, and spinning quite fast, since in the same time we had only moved 1/52th of our orbit, right? As it turns out, the sun's surface spins with a period of 36 days near the poles, and faster with a period of about 25 days at the equator. This meant I had accidentally done some actual observational science, seeing the rotational period of the sun. To make this more obvious, I started taking composite shots of the sun every day. Eventually I missed one because of a violent outbreak of British weather, but I carried on going, and you can see it. The sun spins. There's a feature here in the far right edge of the first frame, and that sunspot actually swings all the way behind the sun and back into view in later pictures. That sunspot is AR4087, which is a significant one because I found out as I was taking pictures of it that a massive solar flare from it had caused radio blackouts across most of Europe and Asia. Everyone say, "Hi, active region 4087. Anyway, I was incredibly thrilled at how these composites turned out because there's something wonderful about seeing the sun be so alive. Even if something as powerful and constant and seemingly unchanging as our sun, change, in fact, revolution, never stops. There is a Foucault quote at the start of Yixing Wu's excellent history, The Cultural Revolution at the Margins. It reads,
"A total description draws all phenomena around a single center, a principle, a meaning, a spirit, a worldview, and overall shape. A general history, on the contrary, would deploy the space of dispersion."
Where the Mars trilogy centers around its particular favorite characters, it tells a story in the classic fashion. On the other hand, there is a pervasive sense that history is happening with or without these characters, and when it happens most directly to them, they have very little to say, and the cosmos remains absurd and inscrutable, despite the neat narrative at the heart of the series. Looking at some of the most significant deaths in the series is a great way to understand this. When Frank has John killed, for example, it feels like his finely tuned plan has worked. And it's not until later in the series that we find out more of the moment-to-moment details that show its clumsiness. In Blue Mars, when characters are reflecting on the night John died, they realize that Salim, the man Frank tasked with the assassination and then poisoned to cover up his conspiracy, wasn't actually the one who killed John. This doesn't excuse Frank, of course. He still did a bunch of shit to incite a riot among a marginalized population, and lied to pin all the anti-Arab hatred on John, some of which he was stoking himself, and then John did die in that riot. It's just that we had the impression everything went to Frank's plan down to the letter, and nothing is ever so simple. When Arkady dies, it's in the gargantuan destruction caused by the collapse of the elevator cable. The cable that the Bogdanovists cut. He is in the path of the falling cable because he's one of many, many people in the highly populated region in its path. It doesn't matter which side he's on. historical forces are rarely laser-focused. There is, of course, also a benefit to the way that stories and narrativization bring elements together and make history more comprehensible to us, because human beings are storytellers. China Miéville admits in the introduction to his story of the Soviet Revolution that he has his heroes and villains, but even in his very Leninist account, there is a lot to learn about other parts of the revolution. The Mars trilogy is best read in conversation with accounts of historic revolutions because of its very sociological style. I think you could draw an equilateral triangle between Cultural Revolution at the Margins, the Mars trilogy, and China Miéville's October. The Mars trilogy is a semi-narrativized history of fictional revolutions. Cultural Revolution at the Margins is a very academic and de-narrativized account, and October is a very narrativized non-fiction. Reading October was when I first learned about the Narodniks, a political faction in the 19th century Russian Empire whose actions failed to directly bring about revolution, but who also inspired other parties who later participated in the events of 1917 in various ways. The Narodniks were a group of socialist intelligentsia who moved to the rural country to try and act as a vanguard to the peasantry in something like the way the Bolsheviks later did vanguardism for the proletariat. It didn't work. The peasants all worshipped the Tsar as an actual god-king who was fighting the corrupt bureaucrats and politicians. Wait, no, I know this one. The Narodniks eventually switched to organized terrorism against the Tsarist state in the hopes of shaking the peasantry's loyalty, and eventually killed Alexander II. Their political ideas and actions were an important part of what unfolded in the next few decades, but not in a directly traceable way. The way that the Reds participate in ecotage, and the ways their ideas evolve and smash together with the Greens and synthesize new positions, reminds me of histories of real revolutions in this way. Pluralism is something often lost in leftist discourses because everyone wants to tell the story of their own team. A huge part of the success of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution was in telling the story of the revolution as it unfolded, and specifically telling it as a Bolshevik story. Its reality, like the reality of all populist revolutions, is one of many factions and parties and organizations pulling in directions that from the inside feel like perfect opposites, but from the outside obviously combine to give a momentum away from the previous order. The Greens and the Reds in the Mars trilogy are fighting broadly over whether to reject terraforming as an imposition from Earth or to change the planet to make it as comfortable for life as possible. These seem like opposite positions. Both, however, start with the right of the people on Mars to decide what happens with the planet. Both of them are free Mars positions. As the original mission unfolds, the first 100 pick up a Japanese phrase from Hiroko, shikata ga nai. It means, it cannot be helped, and is a common idiom like, it is what it is, but it changes meaning subtly throughout repeated use by the characters, and also as a motif in the writing. There's a chapter titled Shikata Ganai right after a character tells several others next time they have a revolution they shouldn't blow so much stuff up. Like, he says, there are other ways, and you turn the page and it says, Shikata Ganai. KSR is doing that thing video essayists do where they end a chapter in conversation with the title of the next. That's the thing I did in this section. This new meaning creeping into Shikata Ganai is taking for granted that they are all working toward the goals they agree on, that they find alternatives unacceptable even if alternatives technically exist. Shikata Ganai then turns from a fatalist expression into a revolutionary optimist one. It also works perfectly with places the story confronts you with situations where either you and all the people you care about are going to be destroyed by the government, or you and all the people you care about are going to have to destroy the government. Shikata Ganai. The ability to disappear and separate effectively from the mainstream is a basic condition for the success of a revolutionary project. This is about how people who are engaging in revolutionary activities can vary their visibility to the state. Ultimately, revolution is not about going elsewhere to make a new society, but it's about changing society. That means having enough space to not be seen by the powers that be, to be able to plan, and also having the hidden structures to allow the things the state tries to make illegal to continue. I think everyone is familiar with the use of underground in this way, as in underground queer spaces, the radical underground, the Underground Railroad. In the US right now, for instance, there is an obvious need for underground structures that protect people from ICE officers and help trans people survive and help people get abortions, as well as underground spaces that allow the invisible planning of actions against the Zionist death machine, and perhaps against the American state itself. There is also a need for spaces that certain people can completely disappear into if necessary. This obviously isn't the whole structure of parallel power, though. There will be plenty of things that can be done, as it were, above ground that are also vital, like mutual aid networks, trade and tenant union activities, and protests. This is why some people use terms to describe this halfway, sometimes visible, sometimes not state of life. I call it the disappearing act. Margaret Killjoy has an excellent article where she calls it the demiground. In the Mars trilogy, Kim Stanley Robinson describes it as the demimonde, a name originating from 19th century France, referring to women who had been exiled from so-called polite society, living on the fringes where they were déclassés after violating the contemporary political moral structure. The tiny village communes that Nergal and Hiroko's other children grow up in are completely underground. You would have to be totally trusted to ever be taken there. The larger towns, like Bogdanov, Vishniak, Mohol, that secret enclaves such as Hiroko's trade with, are much more open. Doubtless any UNTA police who tried to go in would be leaving in a body bag, but it's a town, it's on the map, it's hardly secret. The most public and open part of the demimonde is Sabishi, the first university on Mars, which becomes a hub of dissident and revolutionary political thought. Utopia as method highlights Karl Mannheim's conception that
utopia is the proper description of ideas that, when they pass over into conduct, tend to shatter, partly or wholly, the order of things prevailing at the time.
I think conversely it's also important to observe that utopian ideas tend to shatter, partly or wholly, when they pass over as well. I think this is the destructive nature of synthesis. I have often been a defender of so-called echo chambers. I think the downsides of dogmatic ideological spaces are fairly obvious. I don't think people talk about their positives or purpose all that often. Echo chambers is a bad name. I don't think they're really echo chambers. I think they're more like the vat of secret sauce, the pure wellspring of absurd and abstract ideological dogmatism, completely incompatible with real life on every practical level. And that's great, unless you're in it, in which case it sucks. But it's great that it exists, and it's necessary for a revolution. We don't spend time with characters during their actual education at Sabishi, but Nergal reminisces about it when he's plunged into the world beyond the underground, and narratively it's clear it served as a stepping stone for him between the bizarre insular world of Hiroko's hidden village, Zygote, and living among the broader population, a halfway lifting of the veil of childhood innocence. Time is also a part of the disappearing act, the shearing apart of social realities. As I already discussed, there is the time slip. Martian days and Earth days are literally different lengths, but culturally, time is experienced in different ways too. I've seen this distinction made a few ways. I saw someone on Instagram referring to black time as a phenomenon. I've also heard the term island time. And I also have seen the distinction described as polychronic versus monochronic cultures. I don't know if there are other examples of monochronic, singular time cultures beyond modern capitalist culture, which commodifies time by turning it into uniform blocks of seconds, minutes, and hours to be filled with productive labor. But maybe I just haven't read enough on it. When people talk about polychronic culture, a culture that can accommodate people's subjective experiences of time based on the stories they are telling together and about themselves, it feels more like they're describing an experience of time that isn't alienated by capitalism. Either way, the underground, the demimonde, the First Hundred, and Martian culture generally absolutely all run on island time. And more so the more radically against Earth power they are. At one point, Anne laments the wristpad communication system. These books were written in the 90s, this is their smartphone. And she says that their supposed freedom to be able to be in contact with anyone at any time is actually a manacle on your wrist. When I read this and looked at my wristwatch, it was like a jump scare. The wristpad communicators, just like smartphones are for us, are an amazing tool to be able to access any information practically instantly, contact people, keep notes, yes, tell the time, and everything else a small internet-connected computer can do. Anne's observation that it also traps everyone into the world of appointments and deadlines is perfectly apt. That seems like a big part of why Hiroko and the farm team just get gone as soon as they feasibly can. They want to be as far as possible away from the normal way of doing business. When they've built up their secret village, their underground networks and trade routes, they re-emerge at a big festival that John Boone is throwing on Olympus Mons. When John sees Hiroko, I think for the first time in decades at this point, he tells her, "We needed you." But Hiroko, being the revolutionary stoic mastermind that she is, knows that what they've been building is what everyone needs much, much more. As the Martian social structures grow, their parallel power also includes parallel economics. The same boffin power throuple who invented the gerontological treatments also invent what they dub eco-economics. I think that might be redundant because economies are structures for organizing ecologies, but it communicates the idea they are trying to create a balance that achieves environmental goals while also creating a more equal society. To that end, they have a nitrogen standard and a hydrogen peroxide standard, like how we used to have a gold standard. Commodity values in trades are measured against the value of tons of chemicals they need to burn. This might seem absurd if we were assuming capitalist trade, but the Martian underground is also really big on the idea of gift economies, where parties are not looking to accrue the most of anything to increase social status, but instead to give away the largest amounts of things to demonstrate their social status. This is my mandatory once per video plug that everyone read Debt the First 5,000 Years and the other works of David Graeber. No, you feel queasy. I feel great. Hydrogen peroxide is a fuel people around Mars need, so it serves as a standard for exchanges where people are trying to get more for themselves, because they can value it in relation to production. The nitrogen is purely for terraforming, and one or both parties in a gift exchange will burn nitrogen proportionally to equal out the exchange. I want to draw the distinction here as gift exchanges and greed exchanges, but Graeber points out how our society creates this false dichotomy by teaching us that every trade is zero-sum with a winner and a loser. In an economy like the Martian hybrid economy, people in any particular trade may want to stop the other party hoarding or doing the gift equivalent, which is known as potlatching, which is basically where someone shows off how much they have by giving it away. And there is some fun character interaction based around this. Overall, though, they're living intentionally and collectively, not playing Monopoly. Even though the utopia is only realized truly at the end, these books should absolutely be understood as utopian fiction. The third book, by this point almost 200 years on from Red Mars, describes a period of human history they dub the Accelerando, where human beings spread all across the solar system, sending habitation missions to different planets and moons. Arts and sciences of all kinds are smashing out breakthrough after breakthrough. Basically, humanity is batting 1,000. All in all, I think there's a lot to take from Kim Stanley Robinson's sketch of revolution. It doesn't have everything, there's no point where infiltration by CIA or spy cop types affects the Martian revolutionaries. But sometimes it's useful just to have a sketch, a roadmap, a vibe even to work from. Every writer on revolution is trying to communicate the same core ideas with their chosen linguistic metaphors. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a system of nodes with a schema of connections between them, and in revolution, there is another system, perhaps of some of the same nodes, that becomes allergic to the original schema of connections and grows to take over the space. Historical or fictional analogies help us take that abstraction and turn it into something we can parse. Take, for example, the elevator cable. The UK's largest economic sector is financial services. The UK makes big bucks laundering American imperialist plunder capital. That means London's financial districts are kind of like Mars's umbilical cord to Earth. If there were a general strike in London shutting down all public transport, that would probably slow down operations in Canary Wharf, but they would likely shift to a mixture of remote working and essential in-office operations. If, however, the critical infrastructure that keeps the finance perverts rubbing their £50 notes together or whatever were destroyed, shut down, or physically blockaded, or, hypothetically, just imagine, the US economy went into freefall, all that would be quite like the elevator cable being cut. And it probably would wrap more than twice around the equator of the British economy and likely kill quite a lot of people. You can make these kind of analogies all over the place, like how London connects the UK to America, big businesses in smaller cities around the UK connect them to London, or extractive trade relationships connect the imperial core to smaller, poorer countries all around the world. All of these are their own kind of space elevator. Sunspots have wide, dark, outer regions, the penumbrae, and darker, deeper, more concentrated cores, the umbrae. Sometimes there can be more than one umbra in one penumbra. Cities have massive urban sprawls and concentrated cores where the most intense economic forces are at play. Sometimes there are several centres in the same city. Sunspots turn with the spinning surface of the sun, but are also shaped over time by invisible electromagnetic forces. Cities are shaped by and grow and shrink and sometimes disappear because of invisible economic forces. Sometimes sunspots form in the wake of a larger sunspot. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, a whole bunch of towns were planned and built to help housing congestion in London, the largest of them being Milton Keynes. Some of them were based on existing small towns or settlements, but some were entirely constructed in one huge effort. Sunspots occur more and less frequently on an 11-year solar cycle, of which we are currently at the peak. The sunspots build up and the sun expels a bunch of energy, and then they die away. The magnetic forces that control sunspots are in a stable cycle. The invisible forces that shape our cities, our construction, and our production, by contrast, are not sustainable. Venus has been pointed out as an analogue and useful research focus for anthropogenic climate change multiple times, most famously by Carl Sagan. The Venusian atmosphere is a fucking nightmare. It's mostly carbon dioxide, thick clouds pressurized into supercritical fluids at the surface where the ambient pressure is over 90 times Earth's and the temperature is upwards of 460 degrees C. Above an altitude of 30 kilometers, the planet is enveloped in clouds of sulfuric acid. The surface of Venus is hotter than the surface of Mercury, despite receiving a quarter as much irradiance, because the thick clouds cause a runaway greenhouse effect. It has been suggested by NASA researchers that long ago, Venus may have had oceans of liquid water, and may have been the first habitable planet in our solar system. This video you're watching now was all the way edited and done, but I just didn't feel quite right leaving it without a picture of Saturn since we missed her the first time round. So we took our telescope out at 2 a.m. before the sunrise and set up to look for Saturn under the light of a pale yellow moon. And there she is. We could see, like with Mars's red, that Saturn was just the right colour, and through the eyepiece we could see her gossamer-thin rings too. At this point in our respective orbits, Saturn's tilt relative to us makes it very hard to see the rings. And in the pictures I took and the video, the rings weren't visible. Here though we see the return of imaginative seeing, because as I stacked the photos together, the rings slowly appeared. What isn't in this image at all is Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Titan is a place that is considered one of the strongest candidates for a habitable celestial body besides Earth in our solar system. It may not have the cultural cachet that Mars does, but there's been a lot of serious thought about human beings living on Titan. So even if Mars was our first stop and it went as badly as possible, Elon Musk or whichever other space billionaire dickhead imposes eugenicist hyper-fascism, all the currency is crypto, and the founder is worshipped as a god emperor, after Mars, perhaps we will go to Titan. And that will be another frontier, and therefore another opportunity for change. Every landscape we find ourselves suddenly plunged into is yet another fresh opportunity for us to make society differently. Sachs goes from one special interest to the next, working on mining, chemical syntheses, processes to heat the planet, or put more chemicals into the atmosphere that will be good for human habitation. Then, as terraforming progresses, he becomes interested in lichens, mosses, fungi, flowers, the design of ecosystems, and permaculture. Finally, in Blue Mars, he is driven passionately in a quest to fix the failing memories of the super-aged. Anne, by perfect contrast, spends 200 years in love with rocks. How many passages there are in these books of Anne happily clunking around, her trouser pockets full of geological samples while she looks for more rocks to take samples from? Reminds me of that guy who got fired from NASA for stealing a bunch of moon rocks and taking them home to put on his bed and have sex next to them. Anne fucking loves rocks. Sax and Anne have this enemies to lovers arc across the series, but Sax doesn't really see Anne as an enemy. He is clearly in love with her, but he doesn't get why she can't just be more excited about all this cool science he's doing. Anne is also clearly in love with Sax, and also hates him with a terrible passion, because he keeps ruining everything she cares about. It feels like Kim Stanley Robinson has given us here a scathing interrogation of heterosexual romance. Sax just kind of does what he wants throughout the books, most significantly when he gets in a plane and decides to just go blow up the aerial lens. Most significantly to his relationship to Anne is when he instructs doctors to give her the gerontological treatment against her wishes after she has an accident in order to save her life. Anne seems to lack agency through a lot of the story, because everything she argues against just basically kind of happens, right? The terraforming debate is conceptually interesting, but it was obvious from the start that they were just going to go ahead with it. However, Anne's insistence opens up a space for people to consider the legitimacy of what they are doing, and that in turn creates a shared sense of deliberation over why and how and when and how much to terraform. Her agency is indirect. It's through the radical refusal. This position of pure critique or cynicism may be abstract or infuriating, but it forms a basis of democracy. Anne Claiborne, more like Anne Kist. Fuck. I once read in a classic literary work, it was a forced femme novella, the assertion that time is a man and space is a woman. I like this idea. I think it's pretty powerful. Time and space are fundamental elements of existence, just as masculine and feminine are basic elements of being in human culture, undergirding practically everything. Yet, on closer inspection, masculine-feminine turns out to be a dichotomy imposed by our own perception, by language, and sometimes by politics misappropriating science. Similar to the artificial division of the body-mind into mind over body, or, for that matter, space-time. In the understanding and exploring of space, the precise and dependable calculation of time is vital at every stage and scale. But also, in the measuring and evaluating and capturing and commodifying and exploiting of space, the rigid regularization and calcification of time is the driving engine. See, time is a man, and space is a woman. One politicized technology I didn't compare terraforming to earlier was space exploration, which is sort of a reflexive analogy, right? Because terraforming would be a part of space exploration. But I think we can expand the same ideas about terraforming to everything to do with space. Space exploration is only really viable as a huge collaborative effort. And with how important observation of the Earth's atmosphere from space is in understanding the climate, planetary challenges like climate change should be understood as matters of space. While I was writing this essay, the American state slashed its science funding in half, reducing NASA's budget by about a quarter, while also pushing this nakedly fascist ideological line trying to erase women and people of colour from the history of space travel. At the same time, the African Space Agency started operations, hiring key staff, with the explicit goal of plugging the gaps in climate data. As America's power over space wanes, the rest of the world steps forward and picks up the slack. We should care about space. We shouldn't just let billionaires have this one thing without any democratic control. Because we shouldn't let the ruling class have anything. All power to the people. Space offers us an incredibly vast imaginative realm to play in. Sure, the history of space exploration has already been inescapably political, and as actual space exploration evolves, there will be more real space politics, reified and specified as it is passed from the abstract to the real. But I think somewhere beyond the boundless expanse, there is a space in our minds that we must not lose sight of. In a sense, the unpopulated, untouched Mars was the utopia. The Mars that existed in Anne's mind. It was shattered when it came into contact with reality, but also at the same time shattered the prevailing order of things. The version of Mars that was then to be fought for as more and more terraforming happened and could not be reversed had to change and become something democratically controlled, something utopian in the classless, borderless, from each according to ability, each according to need kind of sense. Utopia and futurity are inherently related concepts. The view of utopia from the present is always looking forwards, and the view of the present from utopia is always looking back. If we accept that we are going to terraform, that we are going to go to other celestial bodies and make them more like Earth, then we declare that we are going to bring the way things are to the universe. And this is perhaps the most hubristic and nonsensical idea we could propose. The universe is, quite literally, infinitely bigger than us. How can we imagine that we are going to make it like us, and it isn't going to make us like it? We must go everywhere trying not to terraform, but instead ready to be areoformed, to be Venuformed and Jovioformed and Saturnized and hell, why not Andromedated too? Everywhere we meet a new frontier, we and it will shatter and become something new, something strange, something Martian. The Mars Trilogy is a lot of things at once, but what always pulls me back to it is the way that despite being so explicitly a story about revolution, about building a new kind of society, about political change, it is also a story that pulls us so far beyond the end of capitalism that the questions about life and existence it considers make revolution almost trivial. Of course it will be done. Shikata Ganai. The cast in order of character mass was Sarah Zedig as Ruth Levitas, Austin Yorski as Yuri Gagarin, Big Tim as Michelle Foucault, Eddie Redmayne as Sophie from Mars, Moho as Mercury, Duna as Mars, Eve as Venus, Conrad Zimmerman as Kim Stanley Robinson, and Jewel as Jupiter. The Sun played herself. Hey everyone, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. This is going to be the Patreon plug part. If you don't already know, my whole income comes from Patreon. So if you want to help me keep making videos, as well as afford to pay my rent and eat food and have medicine, please go to patreon.com/SophieFromMars. There you can see videos early when they're done for only $2. Like this one has been up for a few weeks now. Also, if you're curious about the making of the video, you may have noticed that I used footage from Kerbal Space Program to recreate some iconic things from the books. That was hundreds of hours of work, and I put together a little behind the scenes video talking about what I did there. And I'm probably going to do another one about astrophotography at some point too. So once again, patreon.com/SophieFromMars. I know this is a tough time for everyone, but from just $2, you could see videos early, get loads of bonus content, and help me keep on making videos. Now that said, I just want to say also, I love these books so much, and on some level, I'm just excited that new people will be coming to these books because of my video, and I'll have more people to chat about the stories with, because, when it happens, it's magical, but I just need to be in, Mars Trilogy conversations all the dang time. And like, I also think I did a good job of like discussing what happens in the story and what it means and what kind of political lessons are being taught without giving the whole thing away. There's a lot still to just get in the books. I didn't even talk about when they blew up the moon.